once in a while, you kind of have to do that because of some conditions, but it's always not a bill for new policy that you want to have that goes into the policy bill or will be in questions. So the process is the governor proposes a recommendation, sort of like the budget. He proposes a budget, he proposes a budget adjustment, a whole bunch of adjustments. The House takes those, we get the House version and we get that. So in that, I wanted to start with a letter that we're still calling the Dear Jane letter. Yes, sir.
We do broadcast this, and for you to be seen, you are just standing in La La Land.
I like La La Land.
It was a good movie.
No.
Try to get the rest of them out of La La Land.
Yeah, okay. Mic is on, it says the light. Okay. So the governor sends a letter to us after the House passes their budget adjustment. I didn't hand that out, but basically I wanted to bring it up because there's really only two objections that the governor had to what the House had did. And we will talk about these things, but that's the extension of the adverse weather conditions for the general assistance, or what people call the motel program, that $1.8 million to keep adverse weather through the end of the fiscal year, and the money that we provide for housing to the VHCB. Those are the only two things that the governor put in his letter that he asked for us to change. I also thought it was good to point out on the end of the letter, the Secretary of Administration says, the governor set out his priorities for FY26 budget, because we're really preparing ourselves in this budget adjustment for the fiscal year 26 budget, the big bill. Those priorities: affordability, housing, public safety, and education. I feel like the Senate has the same priorities. I definitely do. And other than education, we address these issues: affordability, housing, public safety in the budget adjustment. We also add with the Senate SAC, or Senate Appropriations Committee's proposed amendment, we help with affordability by helping our towns that were hurt by floods and with infrastructure. So I think we're aligned on the priorities, and we just had a couple differences with the administration on what we're proposing in the budget adjustment. So that's why I gave you this handout, which just has the two tables, because I thought this was a very easy way to show how little there is difference as far as dollars. So there are some language changes that we make, but as I said, as far as what the House did, the governor only had these $2 amounts. So this sheet will show you the proposed changes that the SAC, or the Senate Appropriations Committee, made. It talks about the sources. So we're taking some money back from the treasurer that I'll explain later, but basically it's $20 million that was appropriated to the treasurer a couple years ago for some bond redemption. The treasurer's recommending that we don't do that bond redemption because we make more money in interest than we would save and buying off the bonds. So the House did 14 million, there was a 20, so we do the other 6 for the 20. We have these few things. We added a position to the Attorney General's office and the Solicitor General's office. This is to deal with the federal lawsuits that the AG's office is doing. There's a lot of need, I would say, to protect Vermonters and the hundreds of millions of dollars of federal dollars that are already promised. And I'm talking about future ones. I'm talking about ones we have contracts and grant signed agreements with. So that's that. So this is a million. So 0.05 is $50,000. The HRC, that's a Human Rights Commission. They're overworked. They had 2 positions. One is an intake specialist, one is an attorney to help with all the cases that the Human Rights Commissions. I think this goes to the housing issue, if we're talking about priorities. And then we have a transfer to the Emergency Personal Survivors Fund. This is for you that have been around for a few years, this was if a firefighter dies in the line of service, it provides money to the surviving family or surviving spouse. The fund normally luckily doesn't have very many requests of that funds, but actually there was like 5 deaths. And so the fund was getting close to 0, and there's unfortunately a couple more. So this money was requested from the treasurer to refill that fund. So that's what that $220,000 is in there. And then there's 1.8 million for additional funds to municipal grants. And I'll explain this more, but then I can answer questions. But last year, after the big 23 floods that struck a lot of Lamoille, Washington County. We did a program in the BAA. It was over $6 million to grants to municipalities. They were small grants of 10,000 to 75,000. We had a couple larger grants than that were separate. But what the Senate Appropriations Committee is proposing is to do the same thing, same formula that we did in 23 floods for the 24 floods for a lot of the towns around in the Caledonian, around St. Jay, and also a lot of the towns in Washington County. I have a list of the towns. I didn't hand that out, but there are mainly in, I'd say, central Vermont and Caledonia counties, and also up into Lamoille County. It was unfortunately the same day in a lot of the same areas except for the Caledonia County. So we just wanted to be fair to those towns that got grants last year for the floods for the floods this year, but the damage thankfully was less, so the whole cost of that is 1.8 million. This includes some money for Addison County towns. If you remember in the BA we did last year, we named the FEMA disaster numbers, and we missed one of the disasters that was declared in Addison County. So there was like 4 or 5 towns that weren't going to get the money. And the senator from Addison County brought that to our attention when we did the big bill. So we added money for those towns, $200,000. We thought that was going to be enough. They were still calculating their damages because the formula is based on how much damage of public infrastructure you have. But it came out that it was more than $200,000. And the administration was like, well, we don't have the $350,000. You only appropriate $200,000. So they didn't send those Addison County towns any money. So in this BAA, we correct that. We add the $150,000 so all those towns get their fair share, and we will send that money out to the Addison County towns. So that's included in the municipal grants. You can also see what the House did, which we agreed with as far as changes the money. They pulled that 14 million back from the treasurer. They had this revisions to judiciary, this $850,000. Folks on the Judiciary Committee probably know about this. This money was going to come out of the judiciary. We're putting it back in so they can spend some money on technological upgrades and the Essex County Courthouse, some conversions to a new accessible bathroom so they can hold meetings in those buildings. And then the things that the governor's disagreeing with is the extended cold weather through June 30th. That's the 1.84 million. That's how much that will cost. And I do have the numbers on how many people that is, how many rooms that is, but it includes, surprisingly to me, 466 children that would be exited if we didn't have a plan for that. We do not have there was not a plan presented on what we would do with those 466 children. So that extends it to June 30th. So VHCB is 2.8 million to finish a project. We had Act 186 pilot was a pilot specifically for housing for adults with development disabilities, which there's a strong need for. And so this the money finishes the projects that were started under this prior act. The 8.6 million to VHCB funding is, I think, an appropriate thing to put into the budget adjustment for 2 reasons. One, we're in a housing crisis. We need to build more housing. VHCB will provide this funding to shelters and permanently affordable housing. But one of the reasons why it makes sense to put it in the BAA is that the VHCB was told in last year's fiscal year budget, we had a contingency for ARPA funds. It looked like we weren't going to spend all the ARPA funds in time, and the Recovery Office was basically going to take it away for some programs. And they thought that could be up to $35–40 million that would revert to these programs. VHCB was in there to get $35 million. In the fall, they were told, it looks like you will get some money, maybe 30 million, maybe 25 million. But it turned out they didn't get any money because when the programs were told we might take your ARPA money away, they started figuring out how to spend it. So that VHCB in anticipation, because not just what we put in the bill, but their communications with the administration through it the summer was that the money would be there. So they put out basically a solicitation for projects. They had a bunch of projects. They didn't get the money. So this money can be used right away. They don't have to go out and find projects. They have a list of projects that applied that they would review and appropriate this 8.6 million towards, there's including in that list is a shelter that'll help take off pressure from the hotel program. They have like 30 or more, I think $48 million in requests. So this is just a small amount of money that helps them meet that need that they have. And there was some concern in our committee that they weren't going to be able to make that decision till May. Based on that discussion in our committee, their board has agreed to move their board meeting to April so they can get started even quicker if we were to pass this, so they can get these projects started as quick as possible. The other thing, just as general information, is this highlight document that you have that I passed out, or that the Senate Secretary passed out. This is just a good document to look at if you just want to get the overview. This table at the top shows you in the rows what the governors recommend, the House changes and the Senate changes. You can see there's very little change in the House and that the Senate made, and the totals. I'll just point out a few things. I think this is very important on the overview, the third bullet point. This leaves $137.6 million unallocated, unappropriated. And this is, I think, goes to the education priority that the governor mentioned in his letter, that this is money that we could use to address the transition to our education financing, to address property taxes, address other things that we don't know what they'll be in the FY26 budget. So we're agreeing to leave quite a bit of money on the bottom line, as we say, or just available for our big budget. We could have proposed things to spend that $137 million on, but we agreed with the governor, agreed with the House to leave that money there so we can prioritize things in the next year's budget. There's a lot of changes dealing with global commitment or Medicaid. That these are really big numbers, $78 million for caseload utilization. As you probably know, we have basically a healthcare crisis going on together with our education funding and property taxes crisis and our housing crisis. But I thought it was important when we talk about the priorities of affordability, housing, public safety, that point out this money that we're giving to the courthouses to improve their technology, information technology projects, so they can help with the backlog and just have a more effective judiciary. The Vermont Veterans Home, this just goes toward the cost, the high costs of providing medical care to our elders. There's a $5.9 million increase just for visiting nurses at the Veterans Home. I think that overall it's a 9-point-something million increase to the Veterans Home that we true up at the end of the year based on actual usage at the Veterans Home. We fixed a problem that with the adult education, we had some people that completed their adult education but couldn't get a diploma just as some technical language. And these are people that kind of need that high school diploma to go get a job. It provides $1 million to the Department of Health for more substance use prevention, which I think is very important, needed. It helps us to ensure that we can use all the federal money. We do have access for the 3 squares, or the help with hunger. There's another $21 million of global commitment, which is a mixture of federal and state funds for nursing home or skilled nursing facility care, because the costs have gone up there. $10 million for stabilization grants. This was something that you could, if you look through the documents, then the governors recommend there was $4 million for stabilization grants for participating providers. But after the governor proposed his BAA, they realized it needed to be $10 million. So it shows as a $6 million increase from the House, but it was done on the request of the governor. There is an urgent need. I talked about the $21 million for emergency relief for the nursing homes, but this is another $10 million for other providers, including the federal qualified health clinics that we all have, not all have, but we have throughout the state, some of them which are in immediate financial need. There's the money for the VHCB I talked about, the General Assistance Program. There's the transfer to the general funds for ERAF, or the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund. This helps towns with their FEMA match. So even if FEMA is going to pay 80% or 90%, there's that 10% match. And that can be a lot on an $80 million project or 80 million of damage. So the state pays half of that. And that this money helps fill up that fund. There are increased pharmacy costs. There's the State Employee Medical Insurance Fund, which had an $18.5 million hole deficit in it. So we topped that off. And then the changes that the Senate made are at the bottom, basically 5 bullet points. We reverted the full money from the treasurer so we could use that money. The $50,000 for the Attorney General position for the rest of this fiscal year, the $62,000 for the Human Rights Commission for those 2 positions, the $1.8 million for the municipalities impacted by floods. There's the $220 that the treasurer requested for the Emergency Personnel Survivors Benefit Fund. And then the one item that's not on the highlight list that I wanted to highlight is we put in language that holds towns harmless for any flood-related abatements that they make. We did this last year in a separate bill. We're putting it into the BA this year, so if a town had flood damage and somebody says, my house is no longer worth $200,000 because it's got damaged, that normally if a town abates property down, they're responsible to the state for any loss to the education fund. This holds them harmless, that they could abate that property and that the state basically takes up that hit. We don't really know how much it'll be, but it will be an expense to the education fund. Estimates right now is only about $1 million. And there's these others are just making some changes to allow the administration to administer the FEMA claims and authorizes the administration to take money out of the Human Service Caseload Reserves for the Child Care Financial Assistance Program. And when I go through my floor report, there's $13 million that's looks like it's being taken out of the CCFAP or the Child Care Financial Program, but it's not. It's being taken out because the utilization isn't there because we're just starting the program. But we're saying if their utilization comes back, they can take the money out of the caseload reserve. So nobody would be denied that benefit or that help with their child care because of the language we put in here. So that's my overview, which I thought was just kind of things to highlight and explain. And so if there's any questions, this would be the time, or you can ask them during the floor speech as well. Senator Hardy, Senator from Madison.
I have a question on that last point. And I see that JFO is here because I thought there was a recommendation that we actually create a reserve in the CCFAP fund itself. So I'm wondering why we were moving it to another fund that is a reserve fund. I understand it's still being reserved, but is there a technical reason why we wouldn't just create the reserve in the fund itself?
I think it was like there's this reserve fund so we can use that. I think there's language. Did we keep that language in there that says that they can create a reserve fund in the future? So that's in there, but we didn't create it. We just said if it's needed, they can create that in the future. So in the future, we have languages, you can't take it away. You have to leave it in there and create a reserve with. So if this happens again, we have language to prevent it from being kind of reverted out of there by creating a reserve. But right now, it says just use the other caseload reserve.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I mean, I understand that, but it doesn't quite make sense, but I trust that this was the right thing to do. I can talk to JFO about why they think that's the right thing.
Yeah, so I think a reserve, if it happens again, a reserve will be set up. But the idea was that we didn't need to set it up right now.
Okay. And I will stand up in the real session to talk about the Addison County money because it's a tradition now.
Yes, good. Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, yes, Steiny.
I have 2 questions, I think, and maybe I just missed you going over. My understanding was that there was an issue with the pension and too much of that money being redirected somewhere else. Did that get solved in our version?
Yes, so it's one of the changes of language, so there's no dollars involved, so it doesn't like show up on some of the numbered charts. And it doesn't even show up because you, as a strike all, you just don't see it. So the House had put in language that said, if there's money left over at the end of the fiscal year, it can be used for anything we want it to be used for, basically. It was very broad, for the general benefit of the state kind of language. The Senate removed that language because in Act 114, what's the pension? 114? So when we passed the pension reform bill, 114, there was language in there that said, if there's leftover money, 50% goes to the general fund reserves, and then the other 25 to the unfunded pensions, and another 25% to this healthcare fund for teachers. So there was a concern that we were, and it said notwithstanding that language, that agreement put the money towards other things. So instead of trying to figure out how to word it differently or how much money exactly, we just struck that language. So that language does not, the House language does not appear. But that's not to say that we might, so that's that $137 million that I talked about that we have kind of left available for next year. So if we did nothing and if we didn't spend any of that, then that construct in Act 114 and that pension bill, it would go to those purposes. I think we're going to want to spend some of that money on things. So that's how we solved it, by just striking the language.
Okay, but the 50% that was part of the pension agreement that we made will still go.
It's still in statute, so that is the law. If there's money there, that's the law, that's what happened. We struck the language that's not withstood that language.
Gotcha. Awesome, thanks. My other question is, what is the Correctional Industries Fund?
Yeah, that is a fund that was used in corrections in our prisons when the prisoners are making items for sale. And so they used to make more furniture, they do the license plates, and they were basically had a negative balance in that fund. And they're basically going through, maybe somebody from corrections could explain it better, but my understanding is they're reevaluating how they're doing these kind of work training programs in our correction facilities. And they're not going to do some of the same things. They're going to maybe do different things. We did get some language from corrections on part of this because there's a study that the House put in on this stuff. But it basically fills the hole that was there from that fund that was used to do workforce training and sell the things that the inmates were making.
Okay, that's helpful. That's what I thought it was, and I was confused because my understanding was a few years ago they were not going to be doing that anymore.
Yeah,
so
and
that
they did.
An existing deficit.
Right.
Okay. Great.
We're just kind of making that whole. Yes, Clarkson.
Thank you, Andy. I think this is great. I guess I have a question, which is you made a choice to reduce the treasurer's one-time appropriation. The House operated with using all 14 million of it, and you're only using 8?
Yeah.
And so my question is, what is the impact on I'm not clear on what the impact is on the choices the House made, which I fully supported on housing, for example. How does that impact VHCB's housing money? How does it impact all the uses that the House chose?
Yeah, are you looking at the sheet?
I am, and
Yeah.
I'm not clear.
Okay. So the House basically took that $14 million from the treasurer, which he was appropriated $20 million a couple years ago. He didn't use any of the $20 million. There's another part. The E-Board took the $14 million away to maybe use for flood work, but under the condition that they pay it back to the treasurer. So they used some of that for emergency in 2023. They paid it back in this BA, the $14 million, to the general fund. The House said, thanks for paying it back. We're going to use it for these items listed below. So that's the VHCB and the housing assistance. So they used the 14.09 of the 14. That's what you had in the bottom. We did not change that at all. But there was 20 million. So we reverted an additional 6 million.
Okay.
And of that 6 million, we're only spending 2.13. And so there's 4 million that we're sending back to the general fund that is part of the 137 million that's available for FY26.
Got it. So it's 137 million. Okay.
Includes this 4 million that we got from the
Included-
treasurer.
Got it. Okay, great. That's helpful.
And then we talked about, there's a bill that Senator Lyons has, about 1 million for medical debt. The treasurer was thinking he would use some of that 20 million for that, so there are other things
There are
out there
other
about.
uses for it, I'm sure. The other question I have for you is, I don't know the last time we actually hired a new attorney for $50,000. So
Yes.
I'm just puzzled by that amount.
Yes, well, if only they only worked for that much. Yes, it's just for the fiscal year. Since this is a budget adjustment of FY '25,
So it's just
50,000
for half a year.
is a guess of what, not even half a year, yeah.
Got it. Thank you. That's helpful.
I think the
I
full
always forget.
salary for next fiscal year is more like, for benefits, and everything, is more like 180,000.
Yes.
Senator Persick, I have one.
Yes,
So the 5.9 million for traveling nurses is a concern. And I'm wondering if the money for emergency fiscal relief for nursing homes, if some of that has to do with traveling nurses too. And if any of them have any ideas or plans, how we're gonna get out of this. It's the same as what's happening in the hospitals.
yeah.
A huge amount of cost to healthcare. Was there any discussions on that?
There wasn't any discussions precisely, although I think the feeling was shared. I think maybe some comments were made about, we got to do something about this huge expense. It is both in the veterans home and in, I think, the emergency relief. I mean, what we're trying to do is the nursing programs that we've been supporting through, like the VSAC, where we would pay back the loans if they stay in Vermont and work once they become a nurse. So there's programs like that we're trying, but it's a slow recovery to dig out of the hole that we have. And it's hard for the nurses that work aside next to a traveling nurse that's getting paid multiple times. They're getting paid. So they say, well, I'll just become a traveling nurse and go to the next town over.
They also feel undervalued because they're the ones that are committed and they're the whole time and were there through COVID. So I just wanted to maybe need to have discussions with Senator.
Yeah, Senator Lyons will
Yeah,
fix
quick
it.
comment. I do know that the hospitals are extremely concerned about this, as we all are, regardless of where they are. And some of our larger hospitals are making significant progress on reducing the number of traveling nurses. That is happening now. But I think what Senator Perslick said about our investment in new nurses and helping them get through their educational program is a good way. Everything is starting to come together, so we'll keep working on it.
It's just quite concerning when we have that big a number for the veterans home, which we know has a pretty high cost associated with it. And so I'm just hoping that we can all work together.
Yeah, in
Address that.
the veterans home bed count, Amy, was it 75? Something like that? 170. So it's 170 beds, but we're spending $5.9 million just on visiting nurses. And then there was other expenses. So,
Andy?
yes,
So-
Senator Westman.
This is the third year that we've had the extraordinary aid for nursing homes. And last year, Dale's estimate was internally within the budget that traveling nurses were costing our nursing homes about $62 million a year.
And some of it is federal funds. It goes into the global
Well,
community.
yeah, but the overall number to pay traveling nurses was
But it's,
62.
yeah, tens of millions of dollars. That luckily we have it, but in years that we don't have it, that means we got to go cut it out of something else to fund that, because that's something that we're definitely going to fund. Any other questions, concerns, comments, accolades?
Bravo.
Okay,
We're on
back to
the
you.
accolades section.